Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. It's going to be a good week. I can feel it. Weather's starting to warm. My snow is starting to melt. And it's just about time for me to put my seeds downstairs and get growing. I know some of you are already growing indoors for your season that comes much sooner than mine. All of us are on a different journey when we come to the way we garden and what gardening means to us. I thought I'd talk about that today as I answer questions and as we chat. What does your gardening journey look like? And of course, I'll be telling you about my gardening journey because I think as we broach this subject, and I've said this before, I don't see gardening as a destination. I know a lot of people, when they first get into gardening, they have a very specific goal. I want to grow tomatoes and harvest those tomatoes and have fresh tomatoes in my kitchen. Well, what do you do when you achieve that goal? Is that the end of your gardening journey? Well, of course not. It just gets you interested in growing more things and setting more goals. And so the goals are important. And on this journey we take as we learn more about gardening and develop that experience, we have to set those interim destinations. I like to think of them as road stops. And it's when we reach those goals that we then determine what the rest of our journey will look like. But there's really no end. Gardening, if you really like it, if you get passionate about it, has no end. In fact, you begin looking at it as just a continual journey. And along the way, you'll come up to some stop signs and some crossroads, and you'll make determinations of whether you turn left or turn right or keep going forward. But gardening is just one of those things that you just keep doing, and there's twists and turns along the way. And I hope you don't look at it as something that will have a finale, that once you do that final thing, you're done with gardening. And that's kind of the theme for the day. And I'll be sharing a lot of those journey decisions I've made, some of those crossroads that I've hit along the way. And maybe that'll help you out as well. Rick is saying running out of space in the garden, and that's one of those crossroads. And I've encountered that many times, especially when you're growing in a small space. What do you do when you run out of space? Does that mean you're done? You filled the garden, you grew the plants, you don't have any more space, so you're done. Well, of course not. It just means you need to find more space, like you begin doing container gardening, or you begin doing hydroponic gardening indoors, or maybe you just completely switch up what you were doing. You've got all your beds in place, you have no more space, but instead of growing all the vegetables that you were growing, maybe you transition to growing flowers and you have cut flowers throughout your house. Or maybe you transition to herbs and medicinal plants and you start growing something totally different with the intent that you're going to focus on your health. And that's what your garden is for. And so this journey we're on is not always a physical journey where we are physically adding more beds to our garden, or maybe moving to a new house like I did 5 years ago and created a whole new garden. Yes, by all means, that's part of the journey that many of us find ourselves on. But it could just be taking that crossroad, moving from vegetables to flowers, or from flowers to herbs, or from herbs to root vegetables. There's so many directions we can take on this journey. I would be interested, and so by all means, please share it in the comment how you feel about your journey. What kind of crossroads have you hit where you thought you were going to do one thing with your gardening and you were trying to learn about something like the vegetables, but something happened that caused you to veer off that path that you had originally taken, and now you're on a new path. The journey continues. It's just a new path that takes you along that journey. Llama Llama saying, what do you do when you have a large garden and still run out of space? They're same thing. Start adding more and more beds. Put the different plants in, put the containers in, just try to figure out different ways. I've done that before where I transitioned from a space that wasn't part of my garden and I wasn't planning on make it part of my garden, but then I ran out of space in my garden. And so the other areas that was going to be lawn for the dogs and the kids, well, once the kids left, the dogs got older, that was prime real estate for adding more raised beds to my garden. So that's always one of those things. That's part of the journey. Sandy's saying, I'm just figuring out how to grow what? Sure. Yeah, figuring out each step on the path is definitely important. I I have encouraged, and you know I do this all the time. I encourage experimentation. I encourage learning. I encourage getting that experience because if you don't have that learning desire, then you're just stumbling down the path, and your gardening journey really doesn't have much direction. You're just bouncing off the sidewalls as you try to figure out where you're going. Do focus on figuring things out. I think that's a grand aspiration, Sandy, is start off by saying, I'm trying to figure stuff out. Well, yeah, that's a good start because that shows that you are willing to develop that experience and get that education and be able to move a little farther down the path so that when you get to a crossroad, it's that experience and that knowledge that allows you to help decide which path you're going to take when you get to those crossroads. Gardens happen as saying getting hit by a hurricane has caused me to switch up my plans for how I was going to lay out the garden. That can be a dramatic crossroad when something like that happens. I did a video and I've talked about the hailstorms we get here in Colorado that have devastated my entire garden. And so I haven't been through a hurricane. My son has been through, I think, 3 hurricanes. So I fully understand what it can do to your landscape and your garden and everything you're trying to accomplish in on this journey. And yeah, what do you do when you hit those crossroads when the garden is completely devastated? One option, and this is always an option on your journey, is to quit. Just leave the path and move on to something completely different. And you'll see this more often with the new gardeners, the gardeners who haven't developed that desire yet or that passion to continue. And that's why I'm always encouraging new gardeners to keep trying. Every year, just keep doing it. Even if it was a terrible year, learn from that and keep doing it because you can always get off the path. But when you get off that path, sometimes it can be hard to get back on. I get comments occasionally from viewers who will say, I used to garden. I gardened 20 years ago or 30 years ago and then stopped. And now that I'm getting back into it, I'm so happy. And I'm so sorry that I missed those 20 or 30 years of gardening because I should have kept going. And that's kind of the underlying point to it today is as difficult as your path might be, keep on the path. Don't take that choice to get off the gardening journey. Keep going, keep struggling, keep learning, and you'll get to where you want to be. And I think again, looking at it as not a destination, there isn't necessarily a point I want to get to. It's that I want to be on the path. I want to be gardening in whatever form that takes. I want to stay on the journey. And I think that's an important aspect. Philip's asking a question. Getting ready to start tomatoes. What do you think about using potting mix instead of seed starting mix? And so this is a good question. And I've started tomato seeds in seed starting mix and I've started tomato seeds in potting soil. And I think the biggest issue is the potting soil you're going to use. So much of what we buy as potting soil at the store, when you open the bag, it's chunky. There are big pieces of wood, maybe bark that still looks like bark. And I am not a big fan of starting seeds in a potting mix like that, because what if that seed ends up underneath one of those chunky pieces of wood? It germinates, and then it effectively gets cut off from the world by a big chunk that keeps it from growing. So if you sift the potting soil, I think that gives the seeds a better start. It's the chunkiness. It's those big pieces that make me usually not recommend potting soil as a way to start seeds. The seed starter mixes are typically a a a mix of perlite and peat moss, or perlite and cocoa coir, and that's it. It's very light, it's very loose. It allows the seed to germinate and the seedling to emerge and the roots begin to grow in that loose medium. And then you transplant it into a potting soil, and the potting soil has compost. It probably has some fertilizers added. It's got all the nutrients that the plant needs. And so that's okay to start in. It's just the giving the seed and that young seedling the best start possible. So what I've done recently, and I have a video about this last year and the year before, I mentioned it, and in the red cup starting seeds in the red cup video I mentioned it. Do both. Go ahead and fill your container, a bigger container like a big red cup, with potting soil. But then at the top, put a small layer of a seed starter mix. And you can make it yourself, you can buy it, just a very small layer of something like peat moss and perlite, so that that seedling can get started and emerge without any obstructions. And then the roots will grow down into the potting soil that has everything that the plant needs to grow. So that's what I think about potting mix and seed starting mix is they each have distinct purposes, and you can use the two of them together to take full advantage of the benefits of each. And so this year, that's my plan, is actually to do more of that. I've got some bigger flats, bigger containers, and that's what I'll be doing, is I'll filling the lower portion with the potting mix and a small layer at the top with a seed starter mix. And you'll be seeing that in videos that will be coming soon, because that takes one transplanting step away. If you start with just the seed starter mix, you're going to have to transplant into a potting mix. And nothing wrong with that. A lot of plants benefit from that transplanting. But if you start in a bigger container, if you've got room for those big containers, then you can have that blend, and it actually works out pretty well for me. Casey, hello to you. I'm planting cucumbers this spring and then planting cherry tomatoes in the fall. I only have one raised bed right now. Could I use the same bed for both? Yes, very possibly. It depends on how long your growing season is. So I'm guessing, since you're talking about growing tomatoes in fall, that you have a very long season and probably a very warm fall that allows the tomatoes to grow. And that's really the biggest factor. You can certainly grow multiple plants in the same bed over the course of a season. For me, with a shorter growing season, what I'll do is I'll, in early spring, grow the plants that like cool weather. So I'll put in spinach, and I'll put in lettuce, and I'll put in some brassicas and maybe some peas in the bed. And then I'll harvest those a couple months later going into summer, and then I'll put in my peppers or my squash or my tomatoes and grow in the same bed a different series of plants over the course of the summer. And then as the weather begins to cool, take out those plants and put in more of the cool season plants. Again, the spinach, the lettuce, the radishes, those plants that can handle the cooler conditions. And so if you plan it right, even in a short season, you can get 2 or 3 complete separate harvests in the same bed. Cucumbers do have a lifespan. Over a period of a couple months, the cucumbers will get so big and sprawling, and the flower production and the fruit production will begin to fall on cucumbers. And so it's an ideal plant because you can see that decline in the amount of the harvest. And yes, by all means, pull out the cucumbers and put in another plant. Something like cherry tomatoes, depending on the variety that you choose, are going to take about 70 days from the time that you put the plant in the ground until you harvest. So, as long as your season is long enough and warm enough during that 70 to 80-day period after you take out the cucumbers, absolutely. You could put those tomatoes into the same bed, and you can expect that you'll get a nice harvest twice, the early harvest and the later harvest. So I like that idea. And that's one of those things that really can develop your gardening experience because in the old days, before I knew what I was doing, I would put one crop in my beds, grow it, harvest it, and my gardening season was over. And I would learn a lot. And the next year I would do the same basic thing with the same plants or different plants. And then I learned that you could do multiple groupings of plants over the course of the season. And so when I started doing that, now I was getting an early harvest and then a late harvest. And essentially I doubled my experience level every year because I had two distinct growing and harvesting periods. And so that's a great way to learn gardening faster is just to grow more during the season that you have and put in multiple gardens within the same beds over the course of those months. And then of course each time you're growing plants, you're learning more. So yeah, absolutely, I think that's a great way to approach it. Serena's wondering, is galvanized steel fencing the same thing as cattle panels? Sort of. So cattle panels are a galvanized steel fencing, but so are hog panels. Hog panels are a galvanized steel fencing. There are a number of different types of fencing, and it's all about the length, the width, the size of the openings. You can see behind me here, that's one of my tall tomato trellises that I make from the cattle panels. And so you can see the shape of the cattle panel and the long, narrow internal sections of that steel. Whereas a hog panel, the openings are going to be much smaller than that. And there are other types of livestock fencing that you can get. So the idea of using it, usually it's a 6 gauge steel, either 4 or 6 gauge, typically depending on what type of landscape fencing it's going to be. So they're similar, and yes, a cattle panel is galvanized steel fencing, but there are other types of galvanized steel fencing that you might have availability to find depending on what kind of ranch supply store you go to. And that's typically where you're going to find those panels, is at a ranch supply store. So Sandy is asking, I've been told that starting seeds inside doesn't really give the expected advantage because direct sown seeds grow with more vigor and catch up with the transplanting seedlings. Comments. It depends. And again, it depends on what you're growing and how long your season is. So uh, tomatoes are the prime example. So if I grow tomatoes indoors at about 8 weeks before I put them outside, when I put them outside, they will be plants already, and then the clock starts for when they're going to produce. If I put a tomato seed outside, I have to wait for the tomato seed to germinate, then I have to wait for it to grow, and it's going to take about 8 weeks until it catches up to the size of the first tomato plant that I put in place. And yes, it will have great vigor and it will grow quickly, but it might not grow so quickly that I'll get as much of a harvest as I would from a plant that I started indoors. However, That's why I say it depends on the plant. Plants like squash, for instance, squash varieties, if you start them indoors, it's usually about 3, maybe 4 weeks of a head start that you'll get on those plants. You transplant them outside. A lot of squashes don't transplant well, so they're going to get transplant shock, and then they'll start growing again. And so I have done some experiments with squashes and melons that now means I only start those plants from seed outdoors, because a 3-week-old plant, like a fast-growing squash, compared to a seed, well, that seed's going to germinate in just a couple days during the heat of summer, and it will catch up and often overtake the transplanted squash. So, a lot of it depends on what you're growing and how long you have. If you've got a long enough season to start tomatoes from seed outdoors, I say go for it, because there's going to be no transplant shock. And the way I start my tomatoes is typically in the seed starter mix, and then I transplant into a bigger pot, and then I transplant again, and then I harden them off, and then I put them outside. And at each of those steps, the plant is going to be stressed. If I could start tomatoes from seed outdoors, I would bypass each of those stress points and allow the plant to continue with uh, happy, carefree existence in my garden, because the roots are growing and they're never being damaged as part of the transplant. And so, Sandy, that's up to you, of course. But I the only plants I'm starting indoors are the tomatoes and the peppers and the eggplants, the plants that really do need a good 8 to 10 weeks of growth. And I just can't put them out. I put a seed outside and expect to get the equivalent of that growth. But even melons, I'll choose a melon, a short variety to harvest, because I have noticed that the melons I've tried do better from seed directly sown. But of course, the squash, the peas, the beans, I'm starting all of those from seed outdoors, and have never really had much of a problem when it comes to how well they're going to grow. They're always vigorous and they always end up doing well. Deborah's saying, have you ever heard of making holes in a bucket, burying it in the ground with a cover on it, then adding compostables in it? Will worms enter through the bucket holes and do their magic work? Yes, I have heard of that. And there's a bunch of videos on that. And yes, depending on the size of the hole, as long as it's big enough for the worms to enter, they'll enter. And in many cases, will start eating whatever that material happens to be. A lot of it depends on what kind of worms you have in your vegetable garden and whether they'll do that. Now, instead, what I prefer to do is take that same material and put it in the compost pile. Or you can bury it without the bucket and achieve the same results. That's the trench composting. The idea for that is you dig a trench or a big hole and you dump those scraps in and then cover them up with soil and then allow the worms and the soil life to eat it. The biggest issue I have with a lot of that is where that bucket is wasted space. You can't grow anything in that. And I saw there's a product, I don't remember the name of it. Maybe some of you from the UK will remind me. It's a product that I've seen advertised in the UK. I haven't seen it advertised in the US. And it's basically a big box that you put in your bed and you fill it with those scraps. And then the worms come in and they'll enrich the soil around the box as they go in and out. But you've wasted all of that space that box is buried or that bucket is buried. And you really don't need to contain that material. Just let the worms flow free through the soil and they're going to find that organic material. You don't have to put it all in one space for them to come and find. If it's scattered throughout the soil, they're going to find it just fine because they're moving through the soil looking for food. So I'm not a big fan of burying the buckets just because of that wasted space. And even though I've got a big garden, I fill my beds with plants. And so losing out on whatever that space might be in the middle of a bed, that could be 2 or 3 plants that were growing in that same space. If I put the materials in my compost pile and then amend my beds with the compost, the same nutrients are making their way to the soil, and the same worms are going to benefit from that organic matter. So I think it's one of those extra steps that really isn't necessary for most of us. And I think there are better ways to get the organic matter into your soil and take advantage of those scraps that you would be using. Shandy's Garden, hello to you. What temp do you I need to get my seed starting mix to for sterilization? Also, since I'll be gone 3 weeks, instead of potting up, can I layer that mix on top of potting soil in a bigger pot? And so you have to think about the reason that you are sterilizing the seed starter mix. If it's a mix you've made yourself and you've never used it before, you probably don't need to sterilize. If it's a mix that you're reusing, and in the previous year you had an issue with fungus, gnats, or damping off disease, and so you suspect that maybe there's a fungal infection in that seed starter mix, and that's why you need to sterilize. Well, now you need to start thinking about what temperature does it take to kill the organisms that are in that soil. And so if it's a fungus gnat concern, you might be able to freeze the seed starter mix, and that it will be enough to kill the fungus gnat eggs and not have that issue. If it is a fungal or a bacterial concern, then you're really going to want to get to at least 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 degrees Celsius. And above that, you can expect that those organisms are going to be killed off. But it needs to be a sustained temperature. I see boiling water, and boiling water does work well in small amounts to sterilize some soil. But some of these organisms that we might want to be killing off in our seed starter mix or our potting mix, they need a sustained high temperature, not just a brief 160 degrees. It needs to be a sustained time at 160 degrees. And so baking is a real good way to ensure that you get that sustained high temperature. And most ovens don't even go down that low. And so just putting your soil in an oven at its lowest setting should be hot enough to kill anything. And I would do at least 30 minutes. Longer is probably better to ensure that you kill anything that you're trying to sterilize for. And as far as potting up, can you layer that mix on top of potting soil in a bigger pot? Sure. There's I don't see any reason that you wouldn't. The biggest issue with sterilizing, if you're doing big pots, is that the microorganisms that are in that soil are what makes the nutrients available to plants. And when you sterilize your mixes, you're now killing all the bacteria, and they have to repopulate the pot to be able to break down the organic matter and release those nutrients to the plants, which is why the quick release fertilizers really are necessary if you're going to sterilize your potting mix, because those plants are going to need nutrients, and a dead soil supplies no nutrients. And so adding fertilizer is necessary, and then allowing the populations of the bacteria and the fungi to develop will take time. And so if you have a pot with a living soil in it, and then you add a sterilized soil on top, nothing wrong with that, but just realize that bit that you add on top is really not adding nutrition to any small seedlings that you're then trying to plant at that point. So be aware of that. Llama Llama, hello to you. So, and you're responding to Shandy's Garden. Oh, sorry, that's probably between the two of you. Let's go to Alora S. I have a space where I have for composting several buckets, but not big enough for a full pile. So do it. The biggest issue when you're trying to compost is developing the volume of organic materials that you need. And so the bigger the volume, the more likely you're going to get a hot pile. That bacteria is going to explode. The thermophilic bacteria will be creating more and more heat within the pile, and it takes pretty large mass, and that mass needs to be a big volume. If you do it in smaller buckets, it's more difficult to reach those higher temperatures. So nothing wrong with composting in smaller containers. Just recognize that it's going to take a lot longer than it would if you were able to put everything into one big pile. And so it depends on how moist it is, how much oxygen you have, how quickly the bacteria populate that organic material. In a big pile, without much work, you could have compost in a month. In smaller containers, expect 3 months, 6 months, maybe even more, because you're not going to get that quick eating, quick populating bacteria. So it just takes longer. If that's your only option, go for it. It's better than not doing it at all. Just realize that the time to get the compost is going to be different than if you could have it in a big pile. And I take my time. I did a video a few years ago. I talked about lazy composting because I'm lazy in the garden in areas that I don't need to work hard. And so I'll put all my material into a pile and just let it go. And it might take a year before it breaks down, but it eventually breaks down and I add it to my garden. But I'm not out there turning it 3 times a week and measuring the temperature and doing all the things that you might need to do to get a really hot pile. I've just got other things that I like to do, prefer to do in the garden. And so when it comes to compost like that, uh, measure the amount of work you have, and that may influence what you do as far as the containers. If you've got room for a whole bunch or more than one small container, I would say try to get a bigger container that maybe is on a stand in that same space. You don't have to do a pile. I'm not a big fan of the tumbler, compost tumblers, because it's just too small volume in many cases. But a tumbler that is 3 times the size of the bucket you would be using means that it will break down faster than the smaller bucket. So consider tumblers or something similar if you don't have space for an actual pile, and that may actually give you some options. So Shiny's Garden says, I'm happy to hear I might not need to sterilize. I'm using mostly new seed mix, using taller pots, not really wider pots. My plant sitter will check the bottom watering. It's all going to be timing. Yeah, timing's important. Yeah, and I think I do have one video where I show the boiling water method, but I rarely sterilize my mix from one year to the next. Last year, I had no damping off disease. I had no fungus gnats. I had no issues at all in my grow room. And so I am reusing a lot of that soil. Some of the plants that didn't germinate, I then put those pumps or those pots back into my container of mix. And some plants that did grow but didn't make it through hardening off, I put that mix back into the big bin. And so I reuse some of those mixes that actually had plants growing in it. And then some of the mix that I never got to that has been stored for 9 months, I'll be using that again as well. And I rarely sterilize because I don't have a reason to. What am I sterilizing for? I know that some of that mix has developed that bacterial life, especially when I add fresh worm castings that are loaded with that bacteria as well. I don't want to kill any of that bacteria. So there's no reason to sterilize just to sterilize. And so you can make that decision. But yeah, if you make that decision, you don't need to, don't feel bad about it. And then just keep track of how well your plants do, and it'll probably be fine. Serena's asking, have you ever grown amaranth? And if so, what were the results? Yeah, I grew a purple amaranth, did great. I didn't grow it to make bread or biscuits or anything. It's just a beautiful plant with some beautiful cascading flowers. And I think 2 years ago grew amaranth in this garden. And so it's one of those that makes an occasional appearance. And I just leave the flowers on the plant, let it go to seed, and then let the birds eat all the seeds. So that's why I grow amaranth, just because I like the way it looks. And then it also gives the little finches something to eat. It's relatively small seed. So uh, let's see. I'm going to scroll up a little bit because I suck. Good question. Who's your pioneer? Do fungus gnats damage plants, or are they just annoying? They're primarily just annoying, but yes, um, they 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 can damage the plants, and it's not the actual flying gnats. It's what's happening inside the soil that is more of a indication that there's a problem. The gnats are actually feeding on the organic material as it decomposes, and it's the fungus that's breaking down those little woody bits. That's why they're called fungus gnats. It's because they're feeding on the fungus that's decomposing that organic matter. And so they're not feeding on the plants themselves, but I have read that they can damage plants in large numbers, probably after they've eaten all the rest of the stuff that's in the top layer of soil. And that's one way to control them, is just allow the top layer of your potting mix to dry out, which will kill or cause the fungus to go dormant. And now the fungus gnats don't have anything to feed on, and then they'll eventually die. And that's one way of doing it. Cinnamon also has some antifungal properties. You'll see people say spread cinnamon on the top of your pots and trays. That'll keep the fungus down, which will keep the fungus gnats down. But I find just allowing like we're talking about going on a trip and you're going to do bottom watering. Bottom watering is the way to water your plants and those young seedlings, allowing the top to dry out between waterings, and that'll be a good way to keep the fungus gnats under control. But for the most part, don't worry too much about them causing damage. They are just more of an annoyance, and almost all of us have fungus gnats at some point or another. Cheryl, hello to you. I had fungus gnats for the first time last year, and a lot of my onion seedlings seemed stunted. Could that be why? Possibly. And again, a lot of times it's more of an indication. If your soil is wet enough that you have a fungus gnat problem, it might be too wet for your seedlings. And so that's my experience that I've seen. If you've got a lot of fungus gnats and your plants aren't doing well, it's more likely because you've created that environment that is inviting to the fungus gnats, and it means it's too wet, it's too humid, and that's more likely the reason why the plants are stunted. And so try to figure out how you're watering and how you can improve it. And usually the plants do better, and you don't have those fungal issues, especially damping off disease. Damping off is actually a disease caused by a few different types of fungus that have the same result. They cause your plant to die. Well, same issue. If you've got a damping off disease problem, it's an indication that you're just keeping that soil too wet, and allowing it to dry out at the surface can cure damping off disease, and it can cure fungus gnats. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. As we talk about your gardening journey, first, all of us should be starting seeds indoors. Whatever it is that you can benefit from starting early, do it indoors. So your journey is now taking you on a path of education about how to start seeds indoors. All of us are going to have those issues at some time or another. You're going to get damping off disease. You're going to get that fungus gnat problem. You're going to overwater. You're going to underwater. You're going to have the lights too high above the plants, and the seedlings are going to get leggy. All of those things are important lessons to learn on this gardening path that we're on towards wherever the journey leads us. And so do it and encounter those problems and then figure out how you're going to overcome the problem and deal with it next time. That's why I say this is a journey and not a destination. This is a marathon, not a sprint. We're going to be doing this, most of us, for a long period of time, many, many years. And so don't look at problems as an issue that is bad. The problems are just new opportunities to learn a lesson as you move forward. And then the next year, it'll be easier once you figure out whatever that solution happens to be. And so I encourage making mistakes. I encourage finding out those things that go wrong because it will ultimately make you a better gardener. And if you can figure out what's going wrong in a nice, controlled environment in your house, then when you get outside, where the conditions are much more variable, well, you've just taken away some of those variables because you now know more about how to start seeds and how to deal with young seedlings. And so outside, when they're exposed to the weather in your garden, you're already a step ahead in giving those plants a better chance of survival because of what you learned growing indoors. So yeah, do it, learn from the mistakes, and look for more mistakes and learn from those as well. Shandy's Garden is asking, have you made a cheat sheet with germination facts like lights, heat, mats, scarification, stratification, days of germination, fertilizer, et cetera, that you offer for sale? I haven't, not one that I have for sale. It's just one of those things I encourage everybody to do, your garden journal and keeping notes and keeping track of things. I did show last year in some of my planning videos that one of the spreadsheets that I had made where I listed the variety and I listed when I sowed those seeds, and then I had a column for when they were going to be transplanted outside. And so you could go back and look at some of last year's planning videos and see how I do it. And I'm on a journey. I'm always doing things differently. And so from one year to the next, my spreadsheet or my notes or my cheat sheet is different because I'm trying new things. I'm modifying what I had the year before. But no, I don't have one for sale. I encourage each gardener to try to put together something like that for themselves with the factors that they are most concerned about. And so heat is a good example. I talk about heat. I have a video from last year with my heat mat, and I talk about some of the temperatures and germinating different plants using different temperatures, and that's why I use a heat mat. So all of my information is out there, but no, it's not in a easy to use cheat sheet because I encourage everybody to recognize the important information that resonates with them and then create their own sheet. Now, there are, like the planter planning app that I've talked about recently. I'll use that to keep track of where my plants are, and that has the potential to become a cheat sheet because each of your beds, you can use the planter app and lay out what plants are there. And then when you click on the plant, you can go to a page that tells you all of those numbers and tells you days to harvest and tells you everything you need to know about that plant. So I guess that would be the closest I would come to a cheat sheet, is just using my planter app. And, of course, there's that link in the description below if you're interested in that. But do it yourself. I think because each of our gardens is unique, each of the tools that we use in keeping track of our plants should be unique. I did a video, it's like 4 years ago now. I did a video on the garden journal, and I listed 20 different things that you could put in your gardening journal. And so check out that video. That might give you a head start of how to lay out some of the spreadsheets or the journals that you might want to be using. And in that video, I visit a a guy from my garden club and look at his journal that he's been doing for decades. And the way he does it is completely different than the way I do it. And that's why I encourage everybody to figure out their own way, because what works for me may not work best for you. And the information I have, certainly, by all means, you can use it, but modify it as you need to. And hopefully that'll make a difference. Serena's asking, what is scarification? How's it done? What seeds need to germinate? Check out my video. And I'm sure Che will put it up here soon. I have a video on scarification and stratification, and it covers everything you'll need to know. It can be a very long topic, so that's why I did a video about it. So scarification and stratification are just preparatory things you need to do to the seed. Stratification is putting the seed in a cold location. So right now I've got seeds in my refrigerator. That's stratification, because they'll germinate better after being exposed to cold. And then scarification is damaging the seed, actually putting a little cut in it or filing away the edges, because the seed is so hard, it might not germinate well. It needs a space for that little seedling to emerge. But there's a lot more to it as to what the temperatures are and what the lengths are and how to do it. And that's what that video talks about. So a lot about it. And there's Jay's link to that garden journal, 15 tips. Although I did 20 tips. So anyway, 15 tips in that video, I guess. And no doubt she's looking for the scarification and stratification video that I did a couple years ago too, because there's lots of good information in there that you should be able to find as you put together what you want to do. Bud says, I put notes in the Planter app for germination notes and other things I've learned. There you go. Thanks for sharing that, Bud, because that's exactly the point I was making, is that an app like the Planter app allows you to do all that. I still do a lot old school and then transfer it to the Planter app. And I'm getting better at actually putting the information directly into the Planter app, but I'll be sitting in my chair or sitting at the table and I'll have an idea and I'll just make a note on a piece of paper to remind myself to put in the Planter app. And it's silly. This is just an old guy like me. My phone is sitting right next to me. I could just as easily pick up my phone and put the information directly in the phone, but I've just got that habit pattern built up over so many years that it's just second nature for me to write it down on a piece of paper and then put it in my phone. So I'm trying. This is what I say about the gardening journey always being the path we're on, and then we get to a crossroad. And so for me, how I enter information is a crossroad. And I can either stay on the path I'm on and keep writing things down, or take a new path and use the Planter app exclusively and put information directly into the Planter app. So you see that analogy, see how this whole journey thing works? As you modify what you do in the garden, you're taking a new path. And that path now leads to amazing opportunities. This year, I've learned so much. I made a whole bunch of videos on using my greenhouse. I've learned more about gardening in the last year because of what I've learned in my greenhouse than I have in a number of years before that. And so my greenhouse, crossroad, totally different path. And it's not just the information about the greenhouse specifically and what is happening in my greenhouse. It's the information that I've learned from the temperatures in the greenhouse, the plants in the greenhouse, that now I can transfer to outside the greenhouse, to my larger garden, because I have comparison points that I can make. How a plant does outside, how a plant does inside. And it's a whole new path. And I look back to that crossroad about 3 years ago when I first decided that I was going to get a greenhouse. And now I think, man, I wish I would have done that sooner just because of how educational it's been. So as you approach these crossroads, if you don't take the turn and you keep going straight, don't forget about that crossroad. Again, the garden journal, keeping notes, keeping track of what your path looks like so that you can revisit that question in the future. And a greenhouse is a good example of that. I've wanted a greenhouse for a long time. I've said that before. And it took decades for me to reach the point that I finally could get a greenhouse. Well, it wasn't one of those decisions that 10 years ago I said, no, I can't get a greenhouse now. And I abandoned the idea forever. No, it was there all along. I just kept revisiting it until I got to that crossroad and said, okay, yeah, now the budget allows, I can get a greenhouse. And I'm on a new path with new lessons and new opportunities in the garden. So uh, your path will certainly be different than mine, but I think our journeys are similar, and how we approach our journeys really makes a big difference overall. So Ajia's garden is asking best vegetables to grow in early spring. And so this is one of those things when we look at the plants, and one of the things you can do is read a seed packet. And if the seed packet says start 3 weeks before your last frost date, that's a plant that you can plant in early spring. Because for most of us, our last frost date is happening in mid to late spring. And so look at the seed packets and they'll give you an indication. If the seed packet says plant after all threat of frost, then that isn't a plant that you can start in early spring. That's a plant you got to wait till summer is knocking and the weather is warm and the soil is warm, and then you can put those seeds and plants in the ground. And so I'll give you a short list, but really the way to learn this is just to read the seed packet and learn more about the plants that you want to grow. There are many plants like kale and spinach and most lettuces that are great for early spring. They grow fast. You can harvest them before the summer plants, and those are the ones that you can get a whole separate season of growing. And they can handle frost conditions. Kale will just pop right through snow without any issue. I got kale in my greenhouse, and I had a day that my greenhouse got down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit inside the greenhouse. That's minus 11 Celsius. And the kale survived. The outer leaves were damaged a little bit because it just got too cold, but it handled the cold conditions without any problem. Peas are another great plant that can handle the cold conditions. Most of the brassicas are going to be the same. So if you're growing broccoli, you can put that in early spring. Now the difference, if you're growing like Brussels sprouts or broccoli or cauliflower, they can all handle some cool conditions, but they'll take a long time to actually grow to the point that you're harvesting them. And so as you choose your early spring garden, anticipate what you're going to do in that bed next. And so with the spinach and the radishes, that's another cool season plant, and the lettuce and the kale, I'll put those in a bed. They're in the bed for 2 months or so. So April and May for me. And then I'll pull them out of the bed. And in June, I'm putting in pepper plants and tomato plants for a whole new garden moving forward. Whereas the brassicas that take longer to grow, you might not get a harvest for like 90 days. So you put them in April and May, and then they're still in the garden in June. And that's when you're harvesting. And now the plants you put in have lost a month of growth. And so in that case, the plants that I'll put in next are squash and cucumber, plants that grow pretty quickly and don't need as long of a heat cycle like the tomatoes and the peppers do. And I'll still get a double season out of those plants. And so there's a few that you can choose from. Carrots can handle some cool conditions. Beets, I like to start beets and turnips ahead of time in spring because they can handle the cold weather as well. So generally, brassicas and root crops are a broad section of plants that will often allow you to plant earlier in the season. But the seed packet will definitely be the one to give you more information about whether they can or can't survive those cold conditions that you might want to put them in. And the soil temperature is really the biggest factor. I talked about this last year when it was just so cold and wet in my June, and I was measuring the soil temperature every single day. And I show it in a couple of videos. It just wasn't warm enough for me to put some of my seeds outside. Now, a lot of those cool season plants will germinate when the soil is cool. And so I like to have my soil at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 15 degrees Celsius before I put seeds out. The kale, the lettuce, the broccoli, they'll germinate at cooler temperatures than that, a cooler soil temperature, but it takes longer for the germination. So it's one of those things, and you can find charts like that if you investigate it further, where you take something like cabbage, which is another plant that you can start early. Cabbage seeds can germinate when the temperature is just above freezing. We're talking cold, cold, but it might take 4 to 6 weeks for those seeds to germinate at that cold temperature. If you allow the temperature to warm up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 Celsius, those same seeds are going to germinate in 3 or 4 days. And so sometimes getting an early start with your seeds really isn't giving you much of an advantage because it takes longer for those seeds to germinate. It's often better to wait for the soil to warm up, then put the seeds in, then they'll germinate faster and grow faster. And it's hard when you're chomping at the bit and the outside is sunny and you want to get started, but do measure your soil temperature and account for that. I visited a garden, a local guy last year, and he had put in his plants, I thought, too early. And it was a cold day that I was visiting his garden, and later found out that his plants were stunted. They just didn't do as well that year because he just started too early. The plants never got a break to grow well because they were struggling from the very beginning. And so waiting a month is hard, but often that month can make a big difference in how successful your plants will be or not. So, Grow Big TV, hello to you. And I used to think this was Joe that was Grow Big TV, but I learned recently this is Corky making a comment as Grow Big TV. Check out the Grow Big TV channel. I had Tony O'Neill on here last week, and Tony has just got so much energy. I don't know how he does it. But shortly after that, he appeared on a live stream that Grow Big TV did. Fantastic. I thought my interview with Tony and our discussion was great. Nothing compared to how good it was on the Grow Big TV. So shout out to Joe and Corky and Grow Big TV, and check out their interview from last week with Tony O'Neill. Great interview, great information. Tony, of course, always is loaded with knowledge and did a great job uh, sharing that on that Grow Big TV. So I thought you guys did a great job, Corky. So keep up the good work. And for the rest of you, check out that discussion because it really is good. A lot of good information on that as well. And yeah, Tony was a great interview, really was. So I'm looking forward to maybe being invited back. But after how well Tony did, he's probably going to be the only one they ever invite because it was just so good. Serena's asking, do you think freezing temperatures and snow will be enough to cold stratify the seeds I plant in the ground, Job's tears and sage. It depends. So the thing about stratification, and like I said, check out the video because I talk more about it. It's not a single temperature. It is often a period of cold temperatures. And so some seeds might need 30 days of cold temperatures, some might need 60, some might need 90. And in that video, I show a really good source that lists a lot of different plants and tells the different um, stratification, because there's like 8 or 10 different stratification methods depending on the seed. Some need cold and wet, some need cold and dry. Some seeds, not many, need cold temperatures for a period of time, and then warm temperatures for a period of time, and then cold temperatures again before they'll germinate. And so I don't know about Job's tears and sage. You'd have to do a little research on your own to see specifically what they need. But yes, the snow and freezing conditions will help when you're stratifying, but it's not an overnight or a weekend kind of thing. Most of the seeds that need stratification needed for at least 30 days, and many needed for a lot more than that. So, gardening with Caitlin, good for you. Subscribe to Grow Big TV. That's fantastic. They're a new channel. They've only been around for a couple months, and great to see that you're going to follow along and see what they're doing on the Grow Big TV, especially when they keep getting the good guests on, and it'll make a big difference. Siki First is asking, I like to sterilize my seed starter so no unwelcome buggies flying around my home. I'm wondering if that boiling water destroys any nutrients in soil like worm castings. So the worm castings have a number of different nutrients. Primarily, it's the nitrogen. But the worm castings also have bacteria that's beneficial. And so boiling water will usually kill the bacteria when you're sterilizing the soil, but it doesn't necessarily kill the nutrients. Now, nitrogen is pretty volatile as a nutrient. And it also moves through the soil pretty quickly. So nitrogen can be leached out, and you'll see this in a hot compost pile. That when you have a compost that's getting up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 Celsius, you're losing some of the nutrients into the air. And nitrogen is one of those nutrients that is lost in really high temperature situations. For just a dousing with the boiling water, I'm not sure that you're really losing much in the way of nutrients. It's more the bacteria that might be in the worm castings that you're really losing when you do a sterilization like that. Big Will Dog 82 just subscribe to the Grow Big TV. So aren't you glad you showed up today to watch Corky? That's awesome. So there you go. That's a really good suggestion from Heidi, and I like this approach. Add the worm castings after sterilizing. That's what Heidi does, and that's what I would recommend. I make my mix and let it sit. And so if I were going to sterilize, I've already got the castings in it. But yeah, absolutely. Use a sterilized set of ingredients and then add the worm castings. And that'll actually help introduce some of that bacteria to help break down the organic matter in the rest of your potting mix. So thank you for that, Heidi. That was excellent. That was a really, really good tip. I'm sorry I didn't think about it, but that's why you're here, because you got good information that you can share with us as well. And so let's get back to the basic idea of our journey and how we approach. Now, when I say gardening isn't a destination, I mean it's not a final destination, and hopefully you don't reach a point and say, okay, I did it, I'm done. And so this is a picture I took this morning. I still have snow on the ground. And actually, you can see it melting around the edges of my bed. So this is a good indication of how you can start looking for microclimates in your garden. And so you can see the snow is melted right around the edges of these raised beds, which show that the beds are warmer than the snow, at least at that lower levels. And that's where the snow melts first. So look for that throughout your landscape if you have snow in particular, to start identifying some of the microclimates you might have. But if you look behind me over my shoulder here, my gazebo that I put in. And so I talked about how the greenhouse was a crossroad point that I had built up to. And I didn't see the crossroad as a destination. It was, I wanted to do it. I did it. Now that it's done, which direction do I take on my journey? And this gazebo kind of falls into the same category. That gazebo was 4 years in the making when I first started putting my plan together. And if you go back 4.5 years ago to my garden space that you see behind me, especially if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen some of my older videos, 4.5 years ago, this space was flat and bare. There wasn't anything here. And the first video I did when I moved into this house 4.5 years ago showed me walking around the bare space, figuring out where I was going to put my gardens and what the plan was going to develop into. That very first plan, and you can see it in a couple different videos I did over 4 years ago, included this gazebo smack dab, and it is literally in the middle of my garden. I took long measuring tape and I measured side to side, end to end, and I found the exact center of my garden. And I wanted a gazebo in the exact center of my garden. And so my plan shows that, and I did not deviate from that plan. And so as we talk about these paths and these crossroads, when I got to that crossroad and I veered to the side to put in a greenhouse and then start learning about growing in the greenhouse, I didn't abandon everything else that was going to be on the path that I was on. I took a lot of that and now brought it with me on the new path. And so, because this gazebo was part of my plan, even though I was on a whole new journey, on a whole new path in the greenhouse, learning about how the greenhouse was going to grow, I knew that the gazebo was going to be a future crossroad on that new path. So it's not an either or, it's not a forget the past and everything in the future is new. You get to bring stuff with you on your journey. It's your gardening bag of tricks, and you can put whatever you want in that bag. The bag is, for me at least, up here in my mind. And so the idea of building a gazebo in the exact center of my garden, that was stored in my bag. And so I carry my bag with me on this gardening journey. And when I get to the point that I can pull that idea out of the bag and put it into practice, now I've created a crossroad. And now this gazebo, and you'll see the development over the course of the next couple years as I put more plants in around that space, because I want to have vining plants growing up the gazebo. I want to make that gazebo a much more inviting space. I'll show you how I do that in future videos. But all of those ideas are what's in my bag right now. So as I continue on the path and get to the gazebo work, I'm pulling those ideas out of the bag and putting in those plants and putting in those borders. And behind the gazebo, that space between the gazebo and the greenhouse, oh man, I've got a ton of ideas about what that space is going to be. And I'll be developing that this year. All of those ideas are stored in the bag that I carry with me on this journey. And when the time finally comes that I can start putting some of those ideas into practice, I stop. It's like a roadmap. I pull it out, I figure out what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to do tomorrow, put it back in my bag, maybe make some notes to help me on the future journey. And then I just keep growing. And so that's That's how I view this gardening journey, is that we don't lose anything behind us, because all of those memories, all those experiences, they're in that bag as well. And that's what allows us to stay on the path and allows us to make some of those good decisions when we get to the crossroad. And so the crossroad, sometimes you have to pull out that roadmap. Where was I headed? What did I want to do? Oh, yeah, can't forget the gazebo. Well, I'll go down this new path, but that gazebo is still in my bag and I still have to do it someday. And then when you finally get those things done, that's where some of that enjoyment just flows out. I'm so happy with that gazebo and putting that furniture in it, and it's a culmination of years of planning and expectation, and then it happens, and I'm so happy with it. It's like, sure, I'm glad I carried that with me in my gardening bag so that I was able to make it happen and now use it for all new things. So backyard garden, thank you so much for that. I agree. It looks better than I ever imagined. And if you go back and look at that planning video I did, all it was just a little square on a piece of paper. That's all it was. But it developed into much more. It just started with an idea, just a square. I think it was a blue square because I color coded everything. And oh man, now it's so much more. That's what this journey is all about. And that's why I think planning is so important. Because if you're not planning, then you're not putting things in that gardening bag of tricks. And when you get on the path and you get to those crossroads, you've got less to help you make a good decision because you haven't put a lot in your bag. Fill your gardening bag. A roadmap is just one of those things that's in that bag. And I think you'll enjoy it when you finally get to a new destination, not a final destination, but one of those new destinations. Big Will Dog 82, hello to you. I just had 2 straight days on 60-degree days here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and it felt wonderful to get in the garden to do some maintenance. That's fantastic. And so, like I said earlier, 60 is 15 Celsius. Yeah, I we had a couple days like that a couple weeks ago. I completely agree with you, man. It is so good to get outside when the weather is warm, and I still have a lot of maintenance to do. You can see behind me, I still need to cut out all those tomato plants in that garden bed. I've got time, but sooner you get to those maintenance chores on those warm days, that's less you have to do when the work is actually piling up. And I'm waiting for warm days to get out there and get some maintenance done. So good for you. I'm a bit jealous. I'm waiting for some warm days so I can get out and do that. Sherry saying, for a vining plant at one or more corners of the gazebo, may I suggest climbing Cecil Bruner? I don't know that plant. It's an antique strain of rose that requires zero fuss and produces small pink flowers. Perfect. That's exactly the kind of plant that I'm envisioning, flowering plants. I also want to put some like cardinal climbers, the kind of plants that attract the hummingbirds, and tubular flowers. And so I want to be able to sit in my gazebo and just absorb the fragrances and watch the hummingbirds that are just at fingertip length away, feeding on those flowers. So thank you for that suggestion. I'll look it up to see if it'll do well in my area. But I really like that idea, and that's exactly the kind of thing that I think it helps to share what you're doing on your journey, because you never know who you're going to meet that's going to be able to help you add to your bag of tricks. So thank you for that, Sherry. I will look that up when we're done here. I'll actually write it down so I don't have to scroll back and try to find your comment later on. And we'll see what kind of roses are going to find their way into my garden. I only have one rose plant in my front yard, but I want to definitely add more. At the Galileo Garden, I did a sensory garden and had a number of different sections I built for the students, and the different sections were focused on the different senses. And so one section was for touch and feel, and another section was for sight, and one of the best sections was for your nose, to be able to smell the garden. And I just love that sensation of my lilacs. That's one reason I love the lilacs. And it's only for about a week of the year, maybe two if I'm lucky. But to walk out my back door and just smell the lilacs that are wafting through the breeze, that's what I really want in the center of my garden when I'm sitting there just enjoying the space. And so roses, great suggestion. And Nachi G is saying trumpet vine and honeysuckle. Yep. I've got honeysuckle, another section. I'm looking for a variety that for my area will grow taller. I've been able to grow honeysuckle about 8 feet tall in the past. And so I'm hoping I might be able to find a variety that can grow even taller than that so we can wind around those supports. But good suggestions. Absolutely. Those are the kind of plants. When I say the cardinal flower trumpet vine is in that same basic idea where it's going to invite the hummingbirds to feed in the center of the garden. So, and there's gardening with Caitlin. Trumpet vines work for hummingbirds. Good, good, good. Always good ideas. And Kevin says hummingbirds love pineapple sage. I'm growing regular sage. I haven't seen the hummingbirds on it, but I haven't grown a pineapple sage. Thank you for that idea. I'll look at pineapple sage as an option because in the new areas I'm expanding, I'm going to be putting more herbs and flowers in. So see, always get good ideas from everybody that has done something different on their journey. Share the information. And it's definitely one of those things that will benefit all of us. Gina says, I know honeysuckle grows in the springs. My grandmother grew it. Awesome. Yeah, the honeysuckle I've got right now that's growing, it gets about 4 feet tall, but there's a couple different types of honeysuckle, and that will either grow on the previous growth or new growth. And the one I'm growing right now is new growth every year. So I need to find one of those that will just keep growing and growing and growing. So I know it can be done here in the springs. Thank you for substantiating that. It's just a question of finding the exact variety that will actually match with the space I have. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that we can find that in the near future. I'd like to, I started a lot of my flowers from seed, and in my pollinator cutting garden area, almost all the plants growing there, I've grown from seed. The rudbeckia, the echinacea, the calendula, all those flowers growing in that space, even the stinging nettle, I grew all that from seed. And so this is one of those things as we talk about this path that we're on. As we continue, sometimes you do need to break from your preferred method. And I'd like to be able to put in the trumpet vines and the honeysuckle and the roses and say I started them from seed. But I recognize that a lot of those kind of plants, those big vining plants, it takes a couple of years for those plants to get established and get growing. And so if I were to start from seed, I might lose out on like 2 years, maybe even more, to get to the point that I'm satisfied with those plants. And so the path I'm on is seeds, 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 start your seeds, start your seeds. Now, this is one of those new paths that I think I really need to make a mind shift and say the plants for this specific area, I need to buy established plants. I need to buy a 5-gallon pot, and that plant is 3 years old already. It's got good growth. Transplant that into the space around my gazebo. And now I've saved myself 3 years on this vision that I want. And so I'm sharing that because I think that is also an important aspect of our gardening journey, is recognizing the habits, the patterns we get into, and recognize when that may stand in the way of what you want to do. That's a big reason why this year I made a big shift. I'm not growing the same old plants anymore. I'm growing what you all suggested I should grow because I was getting into doing the same thing year after year, the same way, and not learning and experiencing gardening like I really like to do. So this year, threw everything out the window. It's all new. I'm on a completely new path with new plants because it's giving me that feeling that I enjoy with the experimentation and the newness and the the awareness that what's going to happen? I don't know. That's kind of fun. I like it. For new gardeners, by all means, stay with the tried and true. It'll give you that foundation. It'll give you that confidence that you really need. But think ahead. Maybe the time will come. You get to that crossroad and you say, I want to try something new. And it's okay. You get to be the one to decide what you want to do in that respect. Caitlin saying a Tennessee nursery shipped trumpet vines for an extremely affordable price. Just letting you know. Thank you for that. Yeah, I will start looking at different nurseries. I've been so focused on getting all my seeds that I haven't actually started looking at the plants. I have ordered a couple fruit trees to add this year, and I've added some fruit bushes to add this year. But yeah, I need to start looking at some of those other plants that need to be ordered. And thank you for that. You've motivated me to do it. And I might just do that this afternoon as we finish the show here in just a little bit. Big Will Dog saying sometimes money trumps the time required. A smart gardener knows when that is, in your honest opinion. Absolutely. And so I like the way you say that. I think smart gardeners are good gardeners. And I don't mean your IQ or how much education you have or what degrees you have hanging on the wall. A smart gardener just looks at everything involved with gardening: the budget, the knowledge, the experience. That's what makes you a smart gardener. And that definitely helps with your decisions and time required compared to money. Absolutely. And so that's a big reason why I start from seed. Because if I go to the nursery and buy an echinacea plant, it's going to be $5, $6, $8, $12. If I buy a package of echinacea seeds for $3, they need stratification. So I throw them in my refrigerator for a couple months and then start those from seed. I'm growing plants that cost me pennies. So I completely agree that money often is a big deciding factor. Time, when you reach a certain age, I anticipate I've got many years left. But for me, 3 years may be more important than someone else who's much younger, who has 3 years to give without even thinking about it. So completely agree with you. Uh, in different respects of gardening, you have to prioritize, and often money will trump the decision on the time required. And I have a lot of space patience in the garden to allow for that time to develop my plants. And then there are other times that other decisions are made because of other factors. Yankee Sister Homestead, always nice to have you here. It's always great to see you on Monday. The chat is so supportive and informative right along with your knowledge. Thank you. Well, thank you for that donation, Yankee Sister Homestead. That's fantastic. You really do. I say this a lot. You really do make my day when I see you and so many others that are here. That's why I do this on Monday. And that's why I'm bringing you, this is another aspect when we talk about the gardening journey. I'm bringing you on my path. So when I say that you put everything in that bag can hold so much. And all of you and your support and your suggestions, all of that goes into my bag. I bring you with me in my garden every time I go to the garden. And so I anticipate that it kind of works that way around, that I'm a part of your bag, whether you realized it or not. before today, start thinking about it that way, that all of these experiences and all of these memories, they're part of your bag as well. So every time I throw out a little tidbit one way or another, it's finding its way into your bag. The question is whether you remember it and whether you use it, completely up to you. But all of the suggestions, all the great tips from Heidi and everything Jay does to put out that information that you can track and follow after we're done with the live stream, all of that is great stuff that you should be throwing into your bag of tricks. Serena's asking, can rose bushes in pots survive freezing temperatures? It depends on the rose. As with most of the plants we're growing, it depends. There are rose varieties that can handle freezing conditions in pots, and there are rose varieties that can't and will be killed off. And so whenever you're looking at adding something new to the garden, you've got to do that research. And that's exactly what I'm talking about with these plants that are going to go in my gazebo. That's what I have to do. I'd love to have a rose, but I don't know which rose is going to work specifically. Now I'm going to look up Cecil Bruner to see if that will work. But I'm in zone 5B and I have very, very hot summers. And I have to find the kind of plants that can handle very, very cold winters and very, very hot summers and dry humidity and wind and poor soil. My soil is a sandy loam, more sand than loam, very, very poor nutrition. So I have to find a plant that likes that kind of soil. There are plants that prefer clay soil. So I may find the perfect plant, but if it needs clay soil with an acidic pH, it's not going to work in my garden. I need to find a plant that likes sandy soil with a slightly alkaline soil. And that's what all of us should be doing as we're selecting our plants. In the vegetable garden, it's not that big a deal. You amend your soil. Hopefully you get it to the point that you want it to be nutrient rich for your plants, and you have a great vegetable garden. But it's the landscape that you really need to incorporate more of the plant growing factors. And this is where the experience and the learning come into play really much more importantly, because you can't put a plant in a space that it's not designed to grow in and expect it to do well. And believe me, I've killed a lot of landscape plants because I didn't do that extra little bit of research to find out if it really would survive in my garden. And then it didn't. And I wasted money, which is why I like to start from seed, because I've wasted so much money from plants that I've bought that it's one of those, I just don't like wasting the money. So I'm going to put the seeds in instead. If the seeds don't germinate or those plants don't do well, you're out a couple bucks. But if you've paid $20 for a honeysuckle plant and the honeysuckle doesn't survive, that's a little more painful, and it definitely hurts the budget a bit more. Colorado Bird Nerd, it's always great to see you here as well. Thank you so much. No longer dread Mondays since I found your Monday live stream. Awesome. What a great way to start the week. I always learn so much. Thank you for sharing that. And you're just so good. Thank you for your support all these Mondays that you've been on and that you've been here. So I do appreciate that. You give me a lot of the support as I move forward as well. So I do appreciate it. Absolutely. Let's see. Wickershire Project Off Grid. Purple tomato GMO is a watcher and weird subject for the next few years. But man, it's truly deep purple through and through. Freak show. Yeah. So I'll end with this because this is pretty big in the gardening world. And so I did a video a year or two ago. It might have been last year, where I talked about GMOs. And I said in the video that you won't find GMO seed. It's not sold to home gardeners. It's not made for home gardeners. And so don't worry about it. It's just not going to happen. And even the produce that you're getting in your grocery store, the tomatoes, the peppers, they're also not GMOs. And so if you saved those seeds and put them in your garden, you don't have to worry about GMOs. The genetically modified organism seeds were commercial agriculture focused seeds. It takes a lot of money to produce a GMO, and they were all being done for commercial agriculture. And so until very recently, that is true. You won't find GMO seeds in the home garden. But there's a company, I think they're based out of Virginia, that developed a purple tomato using GMO methods because they're focused on the nutrients within that tomato. And I think it was a snapdragon that they matched snapdragon with tomato, completely different genus, so they wouldn't normally cross pollinate, and they created this super deep purple tomato. That's the first one. That's the first GMO seed that you will see available. Many, many seed companies have signed a non-GMO pledge. And so I think most of the seed companies that we all tend to buy from, the biggest companies, they've all signed that pledge. So even though this GMO seed is available, I'm going to be interested to find how readily available it is, where you're going to be able to buy it, because you're probably not going to find it at any of the big seed sources online because they've all said they're not going to sell GMO seed. So big news, new news. And I agree with you. It's a new subject, and it's going to be interesting to see if this opens up new development of seeds, new research. I don't know, but it's something until very recently we never had issue with. And whether you're pro GMO, anti GMO, really doesn't matter in this conversation. It's here. And we just have to be aware of that. It's up to you to decide whether you're going to grow it in your garden if you can find the seed. And like I said, I don't even know where you can find the seed at this point. So we'll just have to wait and see. There's Jay with a good link. Thank you for that. Norfolk Healthy Produce. Okay, appreciate that. I'll look that up because I'm aware of it, but I haven't actually gone to their website to see what's happening with it. So very, very interesting stuff because home gardening has taken over the world. So many more gardeners are trying to grow their own food now that maybe the Norfolk company recognize that it's time, because there's enough gardeners that maybe it will be worthwhile financially to put in all the effort to develop some of these seeds. So we'll see. Interesting information as we move forward. So, hey, let's do this again next Monday. This is such a great way to start my gardening week, and your gardening week is to be live and chat back and forth and share some ideas. And as we finish, I'd like you to think about your bag of tricks, the bag you carry with you on your gardening journey, and start thinking about what you want to put in that bag, but maybe more importantly, what you pull out of the bag and when you use it to continue on your journey to take advantage of everything you're storing in your bag. Don't just throw it in, use it. Use that information, use the experience, use the memories to make your gardening journey more beneficial for everybody around you. And of course, above all, enjoy gardening. I'll see you next week.